Dead on Arrival. A Fort Smith Western Tale. Volume 4. By Chris Lowry. Chapter 1. Marshal. Ned scurried to the end of the plank boardwalk, straw broom gripped tight in two hands. Ned? Eldridge Sample leaned against the hitching post in front of the general store and knocked thick mud off his worn boots. Morning, Marshal, Ned stammered again. His circle spectacles perched on the end of his thin nose made his watery eyes look over large and gave him a perpetual state of looking surprised. Good morning, Ned, Eldridge observed the niceties. The proprietor of the general store had a long history of taking his time getting to the point. The marshal had worked to dissuade him of it a time or two, figuring a man had better things to do than beat around a bush, but Ned seemed determined to cling to the habit. Heading to the train? Ned glanced toward the station at the far end of town. A giant iron horse squatted on the tracks, pointed east and bellowing steam. Judge has got me running up to West Plains to pick up an outlaw, Eldridge said. Ned nodded as if this news didn't surprise him. It had not, in fact. He had discussed the marshal's itinerary with Judge Isaac Parker that very morning as the ex-senator turned judicator stopped by the store on his way to the courthouse. A notorious scofflaw, Ned stammered. He blinked at the train as a bellow steam shot skyward in a shrill screeching hoot with the train's hort. All the worst ones are. Eldridge tipped his hat and turned to go. Marshal, Ned called out to him again. Eldridge tucked his head over his shoulder, a grim set to his lips. I'm trying to make the train, Ned. The proprietor gulped and stuttered a few times. Darla's on that train, he finally managed to get out. Your wife? She's going that way to meet her sister from back east. New York City. We're bringing her out here to make a new life for herself. Seems like a nice thing for you to do. Eldridge took a step away from the post. Could you look out for her? On the way? Ned said. Eldridge considered his request for a mere moment. Ned had some trouble in the past due to his wife's troubled past. He didn't begrudge anyone their past. Few enough people in the world had seen the things he had seen, and fewer still done the things he had done. The marshal knew he was not in a position to judge anyone on their choices, and when Ned killed a couple of cowboys intent on reminding his wife of her former station, he figured the man was justified. So did Judge Parker, who deemed it self-defense and a moral obligation. Didn't mean the woman couldn't run up against trouble again. Ned, he said. It'd be my honor. The slope-shouldered store owner beamed and Eldridge watched his grip on the broom relax enough that his bone-white knuckles turned closer to their original color. He didn't imagine the man even stood up a little straighter as he smiled at Eldridge. I'd be awful grateful, said Ned. Eldridge waved him off. I'd enjoy the company, said Eldridge. But she'll have to watch me sleep most of the way. Afraid I was up almost all night. He shot a glance toward the facade of the Avant-Garde, the brothel and private club he helped his friend, Kitty, open. Ned tittered, like a man let in on a secret, and blushed crimson from the tight collar of his striped shirt to the fringe of his receding hairline. I'm sure she won't mind, he stammered again. Eldridge tipped his hat, and though he wasn't a man to rush much, he stepped faster toward the waiting train. The whistle shrieked again to announce the departure, and he grabbed a rail and swung off the platform as the giant metal beast began the sluggish rise to speed toward the east. Chapter 2. Marshal, Nora purred, and Eldridge found a more primal part of him responding to the sound of it. Her flaming red hair offset porcelain skin, smooth and elegant with world-wise blue eyes that almost sparkled in merriment. He supposed she had a reason as he settled his 6'6" frame into the seat next to her. Long legs stretched across the polished floor of the narrow car. Bet you're happy no one is sitting across from us. I am, he agreed. He had scared off a couple of brave dandies who gave thought to trying, though. His practiced scowl was enough. Hear you're headed to meet someone. I hear you're doing the same, she answered just as fast. He liked wit in a woman, and the classic Irish looks didn't hurt either. Eldridge shifted in the seat in search of greater comfort. He glanced at the tip of her booted feet, the silk contours of her dress failing to hide the fact of her long thin leg. She was a woman to be appreciated, for sure. She settled her ankles, one over the other as the train started away from the station. Have I heard of the notorious outlaw you're going to retrieve? She asked. Like a lady, Eldridge thought. Ned had worked to help her educate herself. Frank Waters, he said, and fished a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. She spied the second Colt Navy revolver he wore cross-strapped to his waist as his jacket moved and took the paper from him. Bank robbery and murder, she suppressed a shiver. The likeness made him look evil, the harsh lines giving the visage a hardness. Killed the teller and 2 men inside a bank, Eldridge said. Shot a deputy who died later. Nora passed the notice back to him. And caught by someone else? She teased. I thought you were the tracker Judge Parker sent to hunt men down. He folded the flyer back and pulled a whiskey bottle from the inside of his coat pocket. I've tracked my fair share, he said and popped the top to swig a sip. He held it out to her and she made a good effort at a small gulp. This one just happened to be caught in a whorehouse outside West Plains, so they have him locked up there. And you're bringing him back to hang him. I don't do the hanging, Eldridge said and tapped the tin badge with the edge of the bottle. I do the bringing back. She shared a small grin with him. You know Ned and the boy worship you. I ain't one to worship. Be that as it may, she sighed at the thought of Ned. My husband is a big admirer of yours. I admire the man myself. For goodness sake, she laughed. Don't let him hear you say such a thing. It would send him into the stammers for a month. Eldridge nodded and smiled around his drink. We'll keep the mutual admiration on the secret side, if it's all right with you. Do you know how hard he works to keep me happy? She said and reached out for the bottle. Eldridge let her take it and watched her guzzle another swallow past her plump lips. If he works half as hard as he does in that store, then you're a happy woman. I am, she sighed and passed the bottle back. He's good to me. You know that, because. She trailed off because Eldridge had known of her past, had helped her husband deal with the repercussions of it. She saw no judgment in his eyes, not in the way he treated her, nor in the way he watched her. She could tell what most men wanted within a glance. It was almost a fog of desire that washed out of their pores. Even Ned, so besotted with her the first time she stepped off a carriage in front of Shelley's saloon in Fort Smith. Not so with the Marshal. He looked at her like she was there, a woman to be heard, and it left her feeling empowered and adrift. Nora wondered if it was because he was in love with the madam of the avant-garde, or if it was just the giant man's way. Do you see how he treats Will? She asked. Eldridge nodded. An orphan boy being taken in by a stranger is no strange thing out here in the frontier. Had Will been a girl, he would have gone to work for Shelley. There are fewer options for unwanted girl orphans. He nodded again, swigged his whiskey and passed the bottle back to her for another round. He didn't mind sharing, the company or the whiskey, and it beat pretending to sleep even as the train rocked along the tracks, chugging through the Ozark Mountains into the southern portion of Missouri. My going to work, she said with a sidelong glance, was so my sister wouldn't have to. I sent her to a private school. What brings her west? The school in Van Buren, said Nora. She's going to teach. He raised the bottle to teaching. Ned has offered to build her home, fund her school, just to keep me happy, she said. I try to tell him he has done so much for me already, I can never repay him. He's a man in love, said Eldridge. I suspect that's all he wants in return. I suspect you're right, Marshal. She reached out for the bottle and held it up. To Ned, she said, and he waited his turn to take a drink. Chapter. The sister was Nora in miniature, a 5-year younger version, less worn, less weary. Her fresh smile bespoke an innocence that sparked something in Eldridge's chest, like a wanting to protect a small child. He let the feeling wash over him. It wasn't the first time he had felt that way. He knew it was a detail of his anatomy, a part of what made him who he was. The kind of man who protects others by any means necessary. It just so happened his means was extreme violence, and he was okay with that feeling as well. So long as those means were pointed at outlaws like the man cuffed next to him. Marshal, Nora purred again. Just in time. They had parted on the train arriving at the station, her on the way to a hotel to meet her sister and he to the jail to pick up his transport with plans to meet the following morning for the return trip. Frank Waters snarled at the women. Quiet, Eldridge yanked on the chain that held the man's wrists together. Waters turned his sneer toward the younger sister and made a rude gesture with his tongue. She wilted away from him, as Nora tucked her behind her shoulder to put a barrier between him. I will miss your company, Marshal, but I'm not sure we can ride back with that behavior. I understand completely, Eldridge said. He tugged Waters onto the train and ducked as he dragged him down the narrow passage and shoved him into a private seating car. The outlaw bounced off the wall and careened into the Marshal. Eldridge swung a fist and cracked him across the jaw. The man collapsed into a seat and the Marshal shoved him into the corner of the car. He stepped back and ushered Nora and her sister inside with a flourish. I think we can expect some privacy. Nora grinned, but her younger sister shied away. What if he wakes up again? Eldridge lay one of his overlarge hands on the butt of his pistol. I think I can keep him quiet. My sister Catherine, Nora made the introductions. May I present Marshal Sample? Her hand was swallowed in one of his as he took it and held it to his lips, just shy of a kiss. Catherine. Call me Kate, she said as she sat in the opposite corner of the car, as far from Waters as she could get. She studied his limp form pressed into the corner of the car. Eldridge settled across from her so he could stretch his legs the length of the car and not be in the way of the two women. Nora has written about you in her letters, said the young woman. Nice things, I hope. Kate blushed. She did not mention how dangerous you seem. Eldridge nodded and smiled. Do I seem dangerous to you? I misspoke, Kate said. It feels more like you are dangerous for me. Catherine, Nora admonished. I only meant, it is easy to feel safe in your presence, the young woman added fast. He took the compliment with a glance at Nora. The train blew a long blast on the steam whistle and began the chugging trek across the mountains to the west. I told her of your kindness and your assistance with making Fort Smith a safer town. It's the reason I chose Van Buren, Kate said. They would not have considered building a school a year or two ago, yet the advent of the railway and the pacification of the area make it seem an opportunity. What do you know of it? It was a port town and jumping-off point for miners headed west, Eldridge knew, though that might not be a selling point to the young woman ready to make roots there. Nor of the whiskey smugglers who ferried barrels past the military occupants into the Indian Territory. I think you named it best, said Eldridge. It's brimming with opportunity. His patrols carried him into the community on the hunt for bad men, but like many frontier towns, there was trouble to be found for any who wished to look for it. Once you've settled in, he said. Maybe we can come over and look at the schoolhouse. Katie brightened at that idea and began to make plans for their eventual visit. Chapter. The train slowed to a crawl on a steep grade that clung to one side of the mountain. The railway men who built here had blasted a ledge into the side of the mountain, carving out a path wide enough for the train cars and little else. The angle of the path and the weight of the train combined so that a man walking might make it up the hill faster. It was the highest point of the trip, and made for a squealing descent as the engineer engaged the brakes to keep from building too much speed going down. The sound of a gunshot made Eldridge bolt upright. Stay here, he stood up and pulled his long pistol from the holster. He yanked the door open and peeked out. A body crashed into him, and pinned his arm to the outside wall as a second man smashed a bottle across his face. He dropped to one knee as the first man dragged and pulled against his extended arm. The second hit him again, and again. The last thing Eldridge heard was the screams of the two women as the brakes began to shriek. He woke up tied to a tree. His hands were bound behind him, the coarse fiber of the rope eating into the raw skin. Nora and Kate sat on the ground in front of him, their dresses covered in dirt and debris, eyes red from crying. They weren't near the train, but in the woods in the valley below the tracks. He could see the ledge where the tracks cut over the mountain through a break in the trees. Guess you're awake now, Frank Waters took 2 steps over to him and planted a boot in his stomach. Eldridge had just enough time to tense up, so he only coughed for a few moments. The kick sent tendrils of pain up from his tortured arms. You should have let me shoot him, a younger man said from behind Frank. You're gonna get your chance, the older Waters said. We're gonna have a little fun with him first. You know who this is, don't you? Young Buck Waters stared at Eldridge. He's a marshal. Hell, you can tell that just from the badge. I don't know, Frank, I think I'd rather we get on with having some fun with these 2 ladies, don't we fellas? Eldridge looked past the 2 men and saw 2 more on the far side of the shallow clearing. They were as dirty and grungy as Buck Waters, dressed in worn dust-covered clothes and rusty pistols strapped in cracked leather. He didn't like the way they were looking at Nora and Kate. He strained against the ropes that held him fast to the tree. This here's U.S. Marshal Eldridge Sample, Frank swung at him. Eldridge saw it coming and turned his head with the blow so it didn't hurt quite so much. One of the grungy pair in the back stepped in for a closer look. His name was Crow and Sample knew him from a wanted flyer in the courthouse jail back in Fort Smith. I seen you before, Crow peered down at him, tobacco-stained yellow teeth behind his cracked lips. One arm was cinched down to his side, lame. Sample didn't recall that detail on the wanted poster and wondered if it was a new development, though the man held the infirmity with a sense of long familiarity. "I figure you was going to come looking for me before too long." Eldridge clamped his jaw tight. There was truth to what the man said, but he didn't want to give them more cause to beat him unconscious or worse, shoot him. He had to stay awake and get free so he could save the two sisters. "He ain't talking much now," Frank spat between his boots. "Didn't talk much when you hit me like a coward neither." He took another swipe at Eldridge, who rolled with the punch again. It hurt more this time, and the Marshal wondered just how much of a beating he took when he was unconscious. Better than being shot, he thought. They could have just shot him when they jumped him on the train. "We need to get a move on," the fourth man said. "There's a telegraph on the bottom side of that hill. Soon as they get there, they'll call up a posse cause of the man you shot." He glared at the back of Buckwater's head. "You rob a train, folks are bound to get shot," the wild-eyed young man countered. "Yeah, we weren't robbing no train, we was rescuing Frank." "We should have robbed it though," Crow complained. "Taken more than these. We should have left him behind." Buck pulled his grimy pistol and pointed the short barrel at Sample. "We can sell the women to the Indians after we have our fun with them, but he ain't worth the damn bullet." His brother cracked his arm up in the air. "I said he ain't getting shot yet." Buck massaged his arm as he set his gun back in his belt. "Besides," Frank explained, "we can't just shoot him and leave him out here. This kind of thing is what you might call a kingmaker problem." "What's a kingmaker, Frank?" "Damn it, Buck, they make kings, don't they? The men who kill Eldridge Sample are gonna make a name for themselves in this world. I say we take him closer to Fort Smith, and kill him there, where folks will know who we are. Then we can cross over and head for Arizona or Mexico, sell these two along the way." "That sounds like a good plan," said Crow. "All right, Frank," Buck licked his lips and turned his gaze upon Kate. "But I get my chance with that one first." Nora grabbed her young sister and tried to insert herself as a barrier again. Eldridge wanted to tell her to be still, to let the men talk and not to draw any undue attention to herself, but it was too late. Frank turned his boot on her. Though he didn't kick her, he shoved her hard enough she sprawled over backwards with a scream. "You ain't getting in the way of nothing this time," he told her as he ignored her tears. Chapter. He didn't get a chance when they untied him. Frank was too smart for that. He pressed the cold barrel of Eldridge's own Colt against his head as Crow untied him and lashed his hands in front of him. Again, the bonds were too tight and cut into the raw skin. Blood oozed around the coarse fiber and dripped down his fingers. Kate bit back tears as she and Nora were shoved next to him. "We didn't bring enough horses for this." Buck swung himself up on the back of a sorrel and yanked the reins. Frank hopped into a cracked saddle and tied off the rope holding Eldridge to his saddle horn. "They can keep up," he clicked to trot off. Eldridge marched to keep up, his long legs matching the horse's stride. The two women weren't so lucky. Frank and Buck rode side by side to the front, while Crow and the fourth man kept bumping their mounts into Nora and Kate when they slowed their pace. Every cry of frustration ripped into Eldridge, and he pondered revenge upon the four men. The movement cleared his sore head though, and he considered himself lucky. He was alive. Alive meant he could still fight, and he had to force the sound of the suffering women from his mind. The two brothers ahead of him were alike from behind. Same build, similar construction, though the younger was more slight, yet to fill out. He was narrow in the shoulder, and thin of neck. Eldridge imagined it wouldn't take much to snap it with a hangman's noose. Or his bare hands. The trail through the woods was wide enough for the two horses to ride abreast. An old logging trail, Eldridge thought. Used by the men to gather timber for the construction of the railway lines. It was worn smooth in spots, though the forest was trying to reclaim it. Small sapling shoots grew along the edges, brambles and briar working their way toward the middle of the path. The sharp edges of growth snagged at the women's fine dresses, tearing at the fabric to the amusement of the two men behind them. They kept up an ongoing discussion about their carnal plans for the sisters, which were answered with sobs from the younger and growing anger from the elder. Eldridge wished he could caution her to patience. Patience had served him well in the war, and though he had never quite found himself in these straits before, he knew that given enough time, he could figure a way out. A posse would be drawn together. Rufus was gone, but Pete would pull together a group of men to hunt down the train robbers. They would come from Fort Smith even as the outlaws led them closer to the city. There was little chance of meeting, Eldridge knew. Getting a posse took time, and getting over the mountains or through them would take longer still. No, There would be no tracking them until tomorrow or the next day, and only then if they could find where the men holding them had started. He knew Rufus could find him. The man had been trained by Indians and had almost a sixth sense when it came to hunting people. But Pete wasn't as skilled, and his pool of candidates less so. It was his fault the women were in the car with the man the outlaws wanted free. He was responsible for their predicament. He was going to have to be the one to get them out of it. They called a halt at 3 and he still wasn't ready. Still wasn't sure what he was going to do. The skin on his wrists hurt. The coarse rope they used was cutting into him, scraping away layer after layer, the blood leaking into the fibers and making them swell up. The more they grew, the tighter they got. He was leaving a blood trail for the posse to follow, but he knew if he kept bleeding like that, dripping and drizzling on the old logging trail, there might not be much of him left to find. A desiccated corpse, maybe. And if he fell down or passed out, Buck would win the argument over when he got shot. So he kept one boot in front of the other, and wished they could find a creek. He'd dip his hands in the mud and let it dry, like a nature bandage. It would slow the bleeding, slow the blood loss. But they didn't cross a creek. Once, he thought he heard one through the trees, but it must have been running parallel to the trail, because he never saw it. The women behind him grew weary from the march, and it dried their tears. When Frank held them up at a crossroads to their trail, Eldridge wondered which direction they would go. He didn't want them to tie him to a tree again, so he settled onto the ground and worked to present the picture of meekness. "You want I should gather some wood," the fourth man grumbled from one side of the makeshift rest camp. "What for?" Crow shot back. "We staying?" "Hell no," said Frank. "We still got 3 hours or so of daylight left to get that much closer to town." He glanced over his shoulder back to where they had left the train and then down to Eldridge. "I want to put some miles between us and where they gonna start looking." "Ain't he the one they send out looking?" "He is," Frank said. "And he's pretty damn good at it, according to what I hear. Ain't that right, Marshal?" Eldridge kept his head ducked low. He didn't want to give them any reasons. A reason to shoot him, a reason to knock him out or tie him up. Shot or otherwise encumbered, he wouldn't be able to do anything to save the 2 women and himself. He hoped this break was a short one. Walking, the outlaws wouldn't get any ideas about hurting the women. Or they could think those thoughts on the trail. In camp, even a short break, they could act on them, and trussed up like he was, the Marshal just wasn't sure he could do much about. He'd try, of course. Trying was what he did best. But in the past, luck had seemed to be on his side, and that demure lady was nowhere to be found today. She must be helping someone else, he decided. Which meant he was going to have to help himself without her. Chapter. Crow, Buck and the other man gathered around the latter's saddlebag as he pulled out a brown bottle of corn liquor and passed it around. Frank watched them for a moment, a hint of annoyance and amusement making equal opportunity of time on his face. "Don't get too into it," he warned them. "We're just having us a little afternoon break," Buck snorted toward his older brother. "We done broke you out and now we're free. We got a right to celebrate." He turned his eye toward Kate at the last remark. "We ain't celebrating yet," Frank said. "We still got a few more miles to make." Buck squatted on his haunches and held the dirty bottle out to Kate's lips. "You got to relax, big brother," he said, eyes locked on the girl as she tried to turn her head away to keep her lips from the bottle. "That'd be good advice for you too, little girl." "Leave her alone," Nora shouted. Crow and the fourth man moved on her, pushing themselves between the 2 women so they were separated. "I said we ain't got time for no nonsense," Frank snapped. "Always time for a little play." Crow grabbed Nora's ankle and yanked her closer. She kicked him with the heel of her other boot. It caught him square on the chest and sent him sprawling. Buck and the fourth man barked out cause of laughter. Crow surged up and sent a backhand across Nora's face. It elicited a scream from Kate, but Nora held her tongue. That seemed to enrage the rough man even more. He grabbed her by the hem of her dress and ripped it as he tried to haul her closer, ignoring the punches and fists she pummeled into his arms and torso. He drew back his hand and cold-cocked her across the chin. The hit took the fight right out of her, and as she fell back, he crawled on top of her. Frank grabbed him by the scruff of his coat and dragged him off of the punch-drunk woman. "I said stop the nonsense," he shouted. Crow sputtered in rage and drew back his hand to catch Frank with a roundhouse. Waters punched him with a rabbit jab. It wasn't a hard punch, just enough to get his attention and snap his head back. Crow howled, more in surprise than pain. If you go for your gun, I'll cut you down, Frank warned him. Crow spluttered and spit. His eyes flared with rage and a hand whipped to the gun he wore on his waist. The fourth man batted his hand away, and grabbed him by the lapels of his coat. He murmured calming words as he pushed the man away from Frank, away from the commotion and confusion of the circle. Buck guffawed. I'm going to shoot your friend, Frank squared off on his younger brother. Ain't no friend of mine, Buck answered. He a friend of yours? He asked the last to Kate, who shied away. She scooted over to her sister and helped her come around and sit up. We get over into Indian territory, we up and leave those two, you hear me? Frank said in a low voice. I ain't got a problem with that plan, big brother, said Buck. Except maybe we need 'em if we come up against Indians or banditos. We don't need them kind. If you say so. Frank glared at the women, and turned the look on Eldridge. You got something to say about it. But the Marshal did not. He kept his mouth shut as he watched Nora sit up and massage her swollen chin. I guess you don't, Buck opined. Guess you won't have too much to say about anything much longer. Frank shoved his little brother back toward his horse. Go get them too, and make 'em ride in front of us. I ain't getting shot in the back. Sure thing, Frank. Buck took a swig off the bottle and held it out to his brother as he went to retrieve the other two outlaws. Get up, Frank ordered as he took a fast drink. Eldridge folded his legs up under him and popped up with the quickness of a striking snake. The move took the man by surprise, and he flinched even though the Marshal made no move toward him. I heard you were fast, Frank eyed him. Eldridge hunched his shoulders, tried to look smaller than his long lean frame would allow. I should just shoot you right here, Frank said to himself. Kate let out a low moan, and he turned toward her. Get going, he said to them and pointed the trio up the logging trail while he retrieved his horse. The other men were coming back to their mounts, and Frank waited for them to get moving before he fell in behind the prisoners. Chapter. He couldn't see a way out of it and it bothered him. The problem was his left hand. It tingled and felt asleep, like a dead weight on the end of his arm, and then it felt like nothing. He'd seen plenty of men who lost their hands and arms in the war, and wondered how he would be as a one-handed marshal. Not much good for gunplay, he imagined, but still good enough to draw first. Dead men don't fight back. Still, he didn't like the thought of losing his hand. Maybe it was just tied too tight, but he knew that even that would lead to a problem if it stayed that way too long. He listened to the women shuffle close to stay with him, his long legs keeping up with the walking horses easier than theirs. Plus his boots were better for this sort of work, the hiking across the overgrown trail. Their boots were made for train rides and town streets, boardwalks and parlors. Not kicking through brush and bramble, stepping over horse dung when they dropped it. One of the coarse threads of the rope we've extended over the others, and he picked at it with the nail on the end of his long finger. He had worried it, tugged, scraped and scratched at it since before they started walking, and he could feel it begin to break. That was part of the problem too. He didn't know how fast he could do it. Didn't know if the men behind him would notice, one finger working back and forth like a saw, fraying the rope a single strand at a time. If he had all night, he could be free by morning. Except once they camped, he knew what would happen to the women. Knew what the men had in store for them. Nora could handle it, he was sure. Her past inured her to the treatment. She could survive the first part. He didn't think Kate would. Her innocence would be ripped away, and then she would be sold to Indians. The Indians he had met ran the gamut of types, just as any other population, including outlaws. There were good ones, bad ones, and most just trying to live and survive. Eldridge did not think these outlaws associated with any but the bad ones. Which made the prospect of the women's future bleak indeed. He locked his shoulders and strained against the bonds. Pain shot up his wrists as his right finger kept working. Until one strand led to two, then more as the weave parted faster and faster. Still, as the sun set further in the west, he knew it wouldn't be fast enough. Chapter. They reached the swollen creek before nightfall. Eldridge thought they would camp on this side and make the crossing in the morning, but Frank had other ideas. I ain't riding all day in wet clothes, he said. We get on the other side, build up a nice fire and hang them all up to dry. The creek overtopped its shallow banks, and the cutout where the loggers had worn a path through was carved away. The turbulent water churned and swirled between the banks. You first, Frank instructed Crow to lead the way across. Eldridge watched the man encourage his horse into the water, watched the water wash up to the flank of the beast. The fourth man followed close behind. Neither horse lost their footing in the middle, and the water was no higher than the bottom of the saddle. Eldridge would be up to his chest, which made it deep for the two women. Now, Frank ordered them as the other two outlaws began to climb up the incline of the opposite bank. "Take my arms," Eldridge said to Nora and Kate, angling his elbows out so each could grab one. "Hold tight," he said as they stepped into the water. Nora gasped at how cold it was, and Kate's teeth began to chatter as they stepped deeper into the creek. He could feel the current pull against them, feel it catch their tattered dresses and weigh down the fabric. It was an animal thing, tugging against them, and their grips grew tighter. He took slow, cautioned steps, and when they lifted their feet, he struggled for balance as the current tried to sweep the two women away. They held tighter, and Eldridge planted his feet, worked to plan his next step so he wouldn't tip over when he picked one leg up. He tottered when he did, and Kate gave a shout before she lost her grip and the current caught her. The weight of her dress dragged her under, but she fought against it, awkward splashing that kept her head and little else above water. Nora lunged after her, but Eldridge snatched her back as the creek carried the young woman downstream. "Got her," Buck shouted and spurred his horse into the woods next to the water, chasing her. "Get them out," Frank ordered Crow as his horse danced a little way after Buck and back toward the creek. Eldridge fought against the current and the woman clinging to him, mewling in worry for her lost baby sister. Crow turned his horse and splashed back into the creek. The beast circled around the two in the creek. Eldridge held Nora's unbound hands to the stirrup, and when she gripped it, he leapt up and yanked Crow off the horse. He slapped the haunch and sent it back toward the bank, dragging Nora with it, and he towed the outlaw under the brown water. Eldridge kicked for the bottom of the creek, fighting with the man to keep him under the water, and keep them going with the current. Crow struggled against him, ripping at his hands around his neck, at first, then fighting to get free and make the surface. Eldridge swam with him underwater, boots churning the surface until Crow found shallow ground and changed their angle, his feet digging into the soft silt on the creek bed. They erupted from the water, and Eldridge yanked the man around, so he was between him and the other two outlaws. He couldn't see them. The creek carried them around an oxbow bend. Crow sputtered as he tried to breath. Eldridge yanked the rusty hunk of metal from his gun belt and cracked him across the head with it. He hit him again, harder this time, and the side of his head caved in. The man gave a funny moan as his legs began to spasm in the water. The marshal dropped him on the creek bank and searched his gun belt. He found a small knife and sawed the ropes holding his wrist. The knife blade was a damn sight better than his fingernail, and the rope was cut in 3 seconds. He almost screamed aloud when the circulation returned to his left hand. The cold water had numbed it some, but as feeling began to come back, the pins and needles were agony. He ignored the pain and checked the pistol. It was wet, the cartridges in the chambers soaked. Good for little more than a club. The knife wasn't much either. A tiny 4-inch blade good for skinning rabbits and small game and not much else. He left the dead man to float down creek and clambered up into the woods. Nora was upriver, and he wasn't sure how far Kate had made it or even if she had. There were 2 outlaws on this side of the water, unless the fourth man came back across. Eldridge didn't want to give him the time to do it. He slipped off his boots, poured out the water and squished back into them again. Then he was off through the trees, hunting for noise or sound to give him a direction to chase. He heard it after a few moments. Coughing. A woman coughing. He peered between the boles and spied Kate sitting against a trunk, bent over, racked with coughs as she brought up Brown Creek water. Buck kneeled next to her, one arm pounding her back. He hopped up as Eldridge stepped out from behind a tree. "I saved her," his boyish face broke out in a big grin. "Yeah, you did," Eldridge agreed. He tossed the knife in an underhanded arc as he kept walking toward the boy. Buck caught it, and stared at it in wonder for a second as Eldridge reached him, grabbed a pistol from the boy's gun belt and yanked it out to shoot him. The young man looked surprised. Blood gurgled out of his mouth as he put a hand to his stomach and fell to the ground. Eldridge scooped up Kate, and ignored the coughing as he sat her on the back of the wet horse. He took the knife back from the dead boy, and checked him for another weapon, but all he had was the dirty pistol. The marshal swung up on back of the horse and held his hand across Kate's waist. He spurred the nervous sorrel toward the crossing. Chapter. Buck! Frank screamed as the horse cantered through the woods. He had Nora on the front of his saddle, one arm wrapped around her holding the reins, the other pressing a pistol to her chin. Eldridge nudged his heels into the sorrel and urged it to move faster. Kate bounced up and down in front of him, her coughing silenced, but Eldridge knew she couldn't hide his figure on the horse for more than a second. They were out of the trees and on the trail. Buck seemed confused at first, like the sight of the Marshal on his brother's horse was too much to believe. He jerked the pistol away from Nora and fired off a shot. Then he jammed it back under her chin. She winced as the hot barrel burned her skin. Eldridge drew the sorrel up and leveled the spoils of war pistol at the outlaw. He wished for his more familiar Colts as he aimed and fired. The shot was high. It took off the top of Frank Waters' head instead of centered between his eyes where Eldridge had aimed. The force of the bullet toppled the man off the back of his horse, taking Nora wrapped up with him. The horse started to skitter off into the trees, but the dead man gripped the reins still and held it tight. Eldridge slid off the side of Buck Waters' horse and dashed to check on Nora. She sat up before he got there. "Hurt?" he asked as he kneeled beside her. She checked and all she could find was the burn on her neck and a few bruises. "Nora," Kate said as Eldridge helped her up. The young girl toppled from the back of the horse and landed in a heap on the ground. Nora rushed to her and rolled her over. "She's shot," Nora screamed. Eldridge moved her hands away and examined the spreading stain of blood on her shoulder. "Grazed," he said as he took Nora's tattered dress in his still injured hands and tried to rip a bandage from it. She took it from him and ripped the fabric asunder. "You're bleeding too," she said. He took the dress piece from her and packed it across the shallow graze. "Hold it and the bleeding will stop," he instructed. Frank's horse neighed and they heard the clip-clop of another rider approaching. Eldridge stood and readied the pistol. The fourth man rode out of the direction of the creek and pulled up short at the sight of Frank's body on the trail and Eldridge standing there, pistol raised. He held up his hands in surrender. "I give up," he said. "I don't care." Eldridge adjusted for the sights this time and opened a hole between his eyebrows. The outlaw toppled on the ground next to Frank, and twitched. The Marshal stalked over to him, rolled him over and unbuckled his gun belt. He settled it around his waist with easy familiarity and returned to the two women. "You shot that man," Kate hissed in pain. "Shot more than one," he agreed. "I got shot," the young woman said. "I got you a ride to see a doctor," he told her and eased her up. "I don't know much about riding horses," she confessed as she swayed on her feet. He helped her up on the back of Buck's horse and placed the reins in her hands. "You just stick close and we'll get you there." He escorted Nora to Frank's horse and assisted her into the saddle. He let the woman settle in while he stripped the outlaws of weapons, and whatever he could find of value. The Marshal placed them in a saddlebag and found the half-full bottle of whiskey. He took a long sip and passed it up to Nora, who did the same. "Watch her," he instructed as he took the unnamed outlaw's horse back toward the creek. He returned in a few moments with Crow's horse and tossed the two dead bodies on the back of it. "I'll send Pete back to get the other two," he told Nora as he mounted the horse again. "We'll split the reward 3 ways." She nodded and urged the horse she was on next to him. She sipped whiskey again and passed it back to him. "Thank you, Eldridge." He knew she didn't mean the reward. He nodded and gathered the lead lines for Kate's horse and the other, and pointed them in the direction of Fort Smith.